We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program research professor of education at NYU, founder and president of the Network for Public Education, Diane Ravitch. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
And I should also say, obviously, author of your latest, at least, Slaying Goliath, The Passionate Resistance to Privatization and the Fight to Save America's Public Schools. Diane, we've spoken, I think, once or twice over the years, but I want to start with just reminding this audience of your background, because you had an interesting sort of journey to get to the place where you became, if not the most foremost, one of the most foremost fighters against the so-called corporate reform.
Yes, I was for many years on the wrong side of these issues. I worked in the first Bush administration, conservative agenda of testing and charters, not so much vouchers, although I had a brief flirtation with them. I also worked in several very significant conservative think tanks, and then about 2007, 2008, I began to realize that the second President Bush's program, No Child Left Behind, was failing, that it was a disaster in the making. Charters, and I also turned against standardized testing.
Diane,
and I wrote
excuse me for 1 second. We're having a problem with we're getting some type of interference. Can I just ring you right back?
Sure.
Thank you.
Fine.
Sorry. Just to pick up where we left off, you were your experience in the second Bush administration.
I served in the first Bush administration, and in the early 1990s, I was a supporter of standardized testing and school choice, and specifically charters. Then I was serving in the Bush administration. And had also serving on the National Testing Board, to which I was appointed by President Clinton in the late 90s. I was in several prestigious conservative think tanks. So I was on the wrong side of the issues. I recognized it. And in 2010, I published a book where I completely broke with all of these positions and said publicly that I was wrong and that testing and choice were undermining public education.
So we had this sort of like ongoing during the, obviously during the 80s, to some extent into the 90s, this perspective on the growth of charters, the idea of, vouchers that were out there. At what point did the sort of like, I don't know, the second wave where you had, I mean, because those were, it seems to me, primarily conservative ideas. And then at one point there was sort of like
and they still are.
And
what actually alarmed me was that having worked in conservative think tanks and knowing how the conservative thought leaders, if you want to call them that, were using Black and Hispanic children as pawns to push school choice. And school choice has long been a right-wing idea. It was the banner of the Southern segregationist governors and senators after the Brown decision, and it was a word that it was a term that was actually stigmatized. People didn't talk about school choice because they understood that it meant a way to protect segregated Black and white schools. In effect, the charter issue was used to promote school choice. And then Betsy DeVos stepped in and made clear that what she really wanted most of all were vouchers. We now have vouchers in almost half the states in the country, and a Supreme Court decision that may make them, that may wipe out all of the prohibitions on vouchers.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in a moment. But at what point did the disruptors? I mean, like, do you put Bill Gates into the same I guess basket as Betsy DeVos?
Actually, I do. Not because they're in the same political party, but because he has supported charters. He supported a lot of the ideas that have been absolutely disastrous for public education. In some cases, he put millions and hundreds of millions behind them. One of his worst ideas was the way to find out who a good teacher is to see which teachers have the highest scoring students, or which teachers can see the biggest increases in test scores. And we know the answer to that now, which is if you're teaching in a very affluent district, you will be considered a high-quality teacher. If you're teaching children with disabilities or teaching in high-poverty neighborhoods, you'll be considered a low-quality teacher. These are Bill Gates' ideas. So, yes, he has been as much of a disruptor as Betsy DeVos. I think where DeVos clarified things was that she taught the public that school choice is indeed a very far right-wing idea, and that these right-wing libertarians have been pushing school choice at least since 1955, when Milton Friedman introduced the idea.
I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at, and I want to get into deep. I've spoken and largely, I mean, in many respects, from stuff that I've read about, that you have written or pointed to, that the failure of the corporate reform movement, the almost $800 million that the Gates Foundation put into their experiment, mostly on the West Coast, but of course there was other programs, and the subsequent Rand report that came out, I guess now 2 or 3 years ago, that basically said, our bad. We didn't get it right. And I want to talk about that. But I guess what I'm just curious about is, like, just to give this sort of like timeline where we have these ideas that are percolating on the right, that are in many ways a Trojan horse to attack the institution of public schools, to attack public school unions, teacher unions, et cetera, et cetera. And then at one point you have like a new wave of people who come in, it seems to me, who they adopt these ideas because they think they sound, because they're used to them in the context of like business on some level. And they're not listening to educators. They're, maybe they're being swayed because you have all the money in these right-wing think tanks. Just give me a sense of like when these different disparate sort of, characters came into this movement that ultimately, and we'll talk about the sort of the Davids in this who slayed the Goliath. But
let me just point out that while I talk about slaying Goliath, Goliath is not dead. Goliath is still dangerous, but Goliath is actually brain dead. And what I wanted to show in the book is that everything that's been put forward as remedies for the school and then mandated, when you say this was only done on the West Coast or this was only done in one place, it was the Obama administration, Arne Duncan in particular, who accepted all of these ideas, expand charter schools, rely on high-stakes testing to evaluate teachers, and close schools that don't get high test scores. All of these ideas are coming from the far right. Now, Arne Duncan's not on the far right. Obama's not on the far right, but the Wall Street money was behind these ideas, and also the very large foundations like the Walton Family Foundation, which hates unions, the Gates Foundation, which loves high-stakes testing, and the Eli Broad Foundation, another billionaire on the West Coast, who has promoted the idea that closing schools will make things better.
So, all right. So, I guess, all right. So, give us a sense of let's start with like the No Child Left Behind. Give us a sense of what that supposedly was about,
Sure.
And then we'll talk about Race to the Top.
George W. Bush's idea was No Child Left Behind, and the basic idea was there had been a Texas miracle simply by testing every child every year and then either rewarding or humiliating the school. It turns out there was no Texas miracle, so the whole program, which was adopted by Congress, was based on a hoax. Texas is not the most outstanding school system in the country. It's a very middling school system because it's followed these ideas. Testing every child every year only makes schools focus more and more on testing, and we have seen cheating scandals all over the country because administrators and teachers have not wanted to be fired or have their school closed. So No Child Left Behind has been a total disaster, and as I show in the book, after an initial increase that came about from test prep, you get a bump from that. The scores just went flat, and it's been now 10 to 12 years where test scores haven't changed at all. So that was NCLB, but even while NCLB, No Child Left Behind, was in effect, the Obama administration added Race to the Top, which was filled with all the same ideas: high-stakes testing, evaluating teachers by their test scores, firing teachers, closing schools, turning around schools by firing everybody. All these terrible ideas were imposed on the nation's school system, and the only beneficiaries were the people who wanted privatization. So now we have about 6% of the kids in the country attending about 7,000 charter schools, and we have a voucher movement that's fueled by religious conservatives who want to see kids in religious schools that are free to discriminate get publicly funded.
This was, I think, one of the sort of classic quotes from, if not Betsy DeVos, then her husband, but I think it was something to the effect of, like, I have no problem with public education, I just have a problem with public schools. In other words,
right.
let's take tax dollars and use them to essentially subsidize parochial schools. I think they were willing to go private just to sort of, as a way of making sure that the parochial schools were there. All right. Well, so give us a sense for those people who are not, who may not have, sort of dug into this. Like, what's problematic with high stakes testing? What is problematic with this sort of value add, I think they call it, a means of determining the quality of a teacher?
Well, all of these very bad ideas, there are two very bad ideas. One is high-stakes testing, where the tests determine whether children are stigmatized as failures year after year. The standardized tests are based on a bell curve. And so people will come in and say, our kids are failing, our schools are failing, which is not true, and we're going to help the kids who are failing by giving them more tests. Well, because the tests are based on a bell curve, there's always a top half and there's always a bottom half. The bottom half is dominated by kids who are poor, who have disabilities, who can't read English, and who have problems in their personal lives. The top half is dominated by kids whose schools are well funded and who come from affluent homes with college-educated parents who make sure that they have health care and are well treated. So the bell curve never closes. So they use this nonsensical claim about the achievement gap, which we will always have as long as we use standardized tests, because the gap is built into standardized testing. Standardized testing is the outcomes are almost highly correlated. They are completely correlated with family income and family education. There may be a few outliers here where you find a poor kid who gets high scores, but they are the exception, not the rule. So all this standardized testing has cost, over the past 20 years, billions and billions of dollars that did not go into raising teachers' salaries, improving school facilities, reducing class sizes, and protecting the arts and all kinds of good things that schools should be doing and have been forced not to do. For instance, 1 out of every 4 schools in the country doesn't have a full-time school nurse. We're in the midst of this massive national crisis, and there should be a school nurse in every school every day, not once a week or never. So we've gotten rid of a lot of good things like the arts and even just play because kids have to be tested all the time. And the tests always show the same result. Rich kids get high scores, poor kids get low scores.
And so how does the value added measure of the quality of a teacher, how does that work, and why is that also essentially it's sort of voodoo in a way, but why explain us for that?
Well, what I showed in the book is that during the Obama administration, under the program called Race to the Top, the administration dangled $5 billion in economic recovery money, and states were told, if you want to be able to compete, you have to change your laws. And one of the things you have to agree to do is to evaluate your teachers based on whether their students get higher test scores every year. And so 45 states changed their laws to evaluate teachers by test scores, and they're still doing it, although it has been tried now for since 2011, and in some states since 2012. We've had at least 8 years of experience, and we have seen absolutely no positive effect, although we have created an artificial or a genuine teacher shortage by firing people who should not have been fired, and by using a measure that is inherently flawed, because the most important determinant of student test scores are out-of-school factors, not teachers. Teachers are very important, but they are not the primary determinant. Teachers affect anywhere from 10 to 14%, 10 to 15% of whether scores go up or down, but the other 85% is determined mostly by out-of-school factors, meaning whether they live in a home that enriches their education and whether they have access to nutrition and health care and so forth. Those things matter more than the teacher.
And I would assume that to the extent that there is we've seen any type of bump or difference between teachers in terms of the grades, that ends up being a function of teachers on day one say, let's set aside the curriculum itself is secondary, or I should say that the curriculum is we're going to do well on the test, and
right.
and losing sight of any other value in what they're teaching kids.
Well, the first thing to know is that the tests are useless for the purpose that they're being used. They're being used to hold students and teachers accountable. And so the kids take the test in the spring. And frankly, I think under the current coronavirus circumstances, all of the spring testing should be canceled, because the kids aren't even going to be in school in many places. But the kids take the test in the spring typically. The results come in August or September when the kids have a different teacher, and then the new teacher can look at the score and see whether the child is ranked high or ranked low, but they get no diagnostic information. This is like going to a doctor and saying, "Doctor, I'm having a problem," and he says, "I'll get back to you in 6 months," and then he returns 6 months later to tell you that you rank higher or lower than people with the same symptoms, but has no treatment because he doesn't know what the actual issues are. That's the nature of standardized testing today. It's utterly, completely meaningless and useless, and it's being used to stigmatize children, to tell them that they failed, and also to evaluate teachers and determine whether they get a bonus or whether they get fired.
So let's talk about when did a significant movement in response to, as we see, No Child Left Behind and then Race to the Top, we're seeing sort of like the ascendance of this so-called reform. When did we start to see organized pushback? Talk to us a little bit about the Davids here.
Well, I give many examples in my book of people and organizations that have fought back. Take Bill Gates. Bill Gates' Common Core, for instance, and I call it Bill Gates' Common Core because he paid for every part of it. He paid for its writing, its development, its evaluation, its dissemination. It was made part of the requirement in the Obama administration's Race to the Top that states had to adopt the Common Core, or they call them college and career-ready standards. And that's been a total failure. They've been rejected by many states after having used them. But most states are still using something like the Common Core. And so this has been going on now, since the passage of No Child Left Behind. And there have been teachers who've objected. But, in many cases, the opposition was bought off. by the Gates Foundation. If you wanted to get a grant from him, you had to be on board. But I give a lot of stories of students, like this Providence Student Union, which fought having a graduation requirement based on standardized testing, of the teachers at Garfield High School in Seattle who boycotted a standardized test because they knew that it was useless, of a civil rights organizer in Chicago named G2 Brown, who prevented Rahm Emanuel from closing the last open enrollment high school in the heart of the black community in Chicago. And he did this not because he had any money, but because he and 11 other people, his allies, sat in lawn chairs on at this school that was going to be closed and said, we're on hunger strike. And on the 34th day of the hunger strike, Mayor Rahm Emanuel gave in, and instead of closing the school, he invested $15 million and renovated it, and it's open now. But there have been stories like this all over the country of parents, of educators, of teachers, of students, of citizens who said, we will not do this. In Massachusetts in 2016, there was a hugely important referendum on the ballot about whether to lift the charter school cap and have more charter schools across the state. And when the Waltons started pouring millions in and saying this is for black and brown children, which is what they always claim, will help to save them. The early polling showed that it would pass overwhelmingly, but by the time the election came around, every local school committee in the state had rejected it, and the teachers' unions were very active against it, and the parents were, and you just go on with major politicians speaking out, and people got together and organized, and they had a theme. The theme was every dollar that goes to a charter school will be taken away from your local public school, which is true. And people said, but we like our public schools. We're not going to vote to defund them. And so that when the voucher vote came around, not the voucher vote, but the charter vote came around in November of 2016, the effort to lift the cap on charters in Massachusetts was decisively defeated. And I have to say the same thing about vouchers. Whenever vouchers have been put on the ballot, they're overwhelmingly defeated, and yet we have half the states in this country having enacted voucher legislation despite popular opposition.
Let's talk about that. Sort of, I interviewed his name escapes me now, but he had a book. He had embedded himself in Success Academy for a year. And
oh yes, Robert. I can't think of his last name, but yes, I know who you mean.
And it was a perfectly civil conversation, and he at least was willing to concede that the way that Success Academy finds its success is that they basically cherry pick the parents, right? I mean, they create
Robert Pondisco.
Exactly.
That's who you interviewed.
And that what they do is they find parents who are able to, either have, like, I don't know, you have a relative, or they have the money, or they have the resources, the social capital, whatever it is, to be able to, meet the standards, and they're necessarily, being able to provide for their kids. And so the kids do better in these specific schools. And we talked about this is draining resources from the public sector schools, and it's a limited number of kids. It's not necessarily scalable. And his argument was, look, we allow rich people to opt out by paying for, going into a private school. This is like a version of that for low income people. And what is your response to that argument?
Well, my response to that is that when you have a school system that's enrolling 85 or 90% of the kids, and you take resources away so that a handful of children can go to a charter like Eva Moskowitz's school, it doesn't make sense, because the regular public schools, as I've discovered in my book and the research for it, are overwhelmingly underfunded. And we're expanding. We can't afford to have two separate school systems, one which cherry picks the parents. I mean, the problem with Success Academy is that it presents itself as a model for the public schools. If all the public schools did what they did, they would be successful. Success Academy gets very high test scores, but Success Academy is not for all kids. the kids who get kicked out of Success Academy have to have some place to go. Guess where they go? They go to the public schools. And so Robert is willing to sacrifice the majority because there'll be a few kids who will get this benefit. The first class at Success Academy had 78 children. 12 years later, there were 16 of them left to graduate. So even those who were admitted, most of them didn't survive. And I would say that that's not a place to invest if we want to have a decent society. If you want to have one school like that, and it should be all of these billionaires who support it, why don't they just support a private school and say, we're going to open a private school, it's going to have very high standards, and most of the kids won't survive, but we won't hold it up as a model for the public schools because it's not a model. And I've talked to Success Academy contributors who give big money, and they say they don't care how many kids drop out. They only care that those few survive. So this is not a model, and it's unfortunate that so many politicians think that charter schools are a panacea when, in fact, they close with great regularity. A report that my organization, the Network for Public Education, did showed that about 40% of the most charter schools get some federal money. About 40% of the ones that were launched with federal funding have closed or either never opened. The planners took the federal money and never opened the school, or within a year or two they were closed. So they have a very, very high failure rate, and in some states there are more charter schools closing than there are charter schools opening. So it's like any kind of free market thing. If you open a restaurant and say this is what all restaurants should be like, that's okay. It's a private thing. If you go out of business, nobody cares. But a public school should be a permanent part of every community. Every community should have good public schools. And by taking resources away from public schools to open up some boutique charters, you're undermining the education, the institution that educates all children and is open to everybody.
Why? And look, I know that there are some decent charters around the country. I think that my personal feeling is that there's some merit that perhaps you could use them as laboratory schools, but you don't need these many, and you got to make them that the experiments are scalable. And as far as I can tell, Success Academy is just simply not scalable. But why are hedge funders so enamored? Maybe it's just my perception, but it feels like hedge funders in particular are really enamored with charter schools.
Absolutely.
And
Well, you're absolutely right. And I think it was, if not this book and one of my other books, I mentioned the story that when Andrew Cuomo first ran for governor, he was trying to raise money on Wall Street, and he was told you cannot raise any money from Wall Street unless you support charter schools. And he was told to go to a group called Democrats for Education Reform, which is mad about charter schools, and every member of their board is a hedge fund manager. And they have deployed their money into political campaigns like a lot of billionaires. Michael Bloomberg is a major supporter of charters, as is Bill Gates and the DeVos family. The Walton family takes credit for opening 1 out of every 4 charter schools in the country. Why do all these people love charter schools? Well, some of them love it because they love the free market, and they don't believe the government can do anything right, and so they think the market will solve all the problems. And the reality is, and I think we're experiencing it right now, the market goes up and the market goes down. The market has winners, the market has losers. The promise of public services is that we're going to have a police force that protects everybody, not just the rich. We're going to have a fire department that puts out fires in every neighborhood, not just for rich people. And that's why we have a public school system. It's supposed to be for everyone who needs a place to go. If you want to pay $50,000 a year and go to a great private school, good luck to you. That's your right. If you want to pay a couple of $1,000 a year and go to a religious school, that's your right. But what these people are demanding is that the public should pay for charter schools that will operate like private schools or religious schools. And now the further push, which we see in Florida and Arizona and in Ohio and Indiana and many states, is the public should pay for religious schools.
Right.
And that's the voucher movement, which is rising very rapidly, even though very few children actually go to religious schools. What they really want is to get the public to pay for the kids who already are in religious schools.
And this is the case that's in front of the Supreme Court now, right? They've heard
yes.
Oral arguments.
The case before the Supreme Court right now, which has a very high probability of being decided against public schools because of the addition of the two Trump judges, is does the state have a right to say that we will not give money to religious schools? And the case is about Montana, obviously, and a family there wants public support to send their children to religious schools. But Montana, like most states, has a prohibition in the state constitution that says no public money will be spent for religious schools. And there have been many, many states that have simply said that their state constitution doesn't actually mean that, even though it says it. Like Florida has a prohibition against spending on vouchers. And they even had a state referendum where the public said 55 to 45, no vouchers. In Arizona, there was a vote just in 2018 where it went 65 to 35, no more vouchers. And the legislature keeps enacting them anyway because they're getting so much money from the DeVos family and so much money from the Walton family and from the religious right that wants public money for religious schools, that we may soon have the Supreme Court decision striking down every prohibition in every state that says that public money should not be spent on religious schools.
So where are we now in this fight? I mean, how, and this is, of course, I know that you wrote this book in response to the Red State Revolt, some people call it, where we had half a dozen teacher strikes, more in states across the country. We've had some since 2018 in California and Chicago again. And I think we have one in Minnesota that is happening. If it hasn't started already, it's ongoing right now. Where are we now in terms of this fight?
Well, where we are now is that, and the reason I wrote the book was because of the Red for Ed movement. The teachers in West Virginia started it 2 years ago exactly, in February of 2018. There's a strike right now in St. Paul, Minnesota, and teachers their number one demand is we need mental health services for our children. We need to have social workers. We need nurses. In other places, like I was in Los Angeles when the teachers were striking, they were striking for social workers, for nurses. I mean, we so underpay our teachers, it's ridiculous. We have teacher shortages all over the country because teachers have been so harassed by all of this over-testing. And I think that what the strikes have done is to awaken the public to this self-attack to underfund public education, which has not only been stealth, it's been incredibly successful. Many of the studies show that people are completely unaware that most states in this country are currently funding schools at a level less than they were in 2008, the last time that we had a major recession. And so our teachers need more money, and our kids are being cheated because they need smaller classes. When I was in L.A., people talked about class sizes over 40, and kids being told you can't take that class because there are no more chairs. The room's too overcrowded. So we do need to pay teachers more. We do need to have a nurse in every school. I mean, at a time of a national health crisis, there should certainly be a nurse in every school. And kids need health care. I mean, all these problems have been brought to light. And so I'm hopeful because the public is awakening. I saw it recently in Education Week that many foundations have decided they're not going to follow Bill Gates anymore. And what they said is we will not support what's now called education reform. We will support education and the arts. We will support education and mental health issues. We will support efforts to stop the school-to-prison pipeline. Those things are really important issues, and they make sense. But frankly, all this testing and all this emphasis on taking money away from public schools in order for a few kids to go to a charter school or to be paid by the public to go to a religious school where they discriminate against kids based on their sexual orientations. This is insane.
Right. Well, so let me ask you this, and I guess in closing, we're at the beginning, I think, of what could be a prolonged, something dramatically different than anything I experienced as in my lifetime. I remember the blizzard of '78, and school was closed for 3 or 4 weeks in Massachusetts, at least where I lived. And, we were out of school for a month, but that was, a localized event. And even probably the towns next to ours, probably kids went to school a little bit earlier. They were afraid about sidewalks. But this is a situation that we're looking at where we could have maybe the majority of public school kids out of school for weeks. And I'm curious as to if you have, any thoughts about where this could take us in terms of, I'm a little bit worried on some level in the context of schools because there's going to have to be some solution. And often, sometimes these solutions stick around because they end up saving people money in some fashion. What is your sense of this?
Well, I think that at the moment, as we know, there are a number of school districts that have closed down in order to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And my concern is that I hope they're also planning to make sure that children have hot meals, because for many, many poor kids, the school is the only place where they can count on getting a meal. And if the parents have to stay home because their kids are home, if they lose their job or if they're simply not paid, then we're going to deepen the poverty and that's really horrible in this country. So that I'm hoping that Congress will act, that it will enact emergency paid leave, that it will take steps to make sure that there's food aid. Unfortunately, as you know, the Republicans thus far have refused to pass such legislation. They think that the Democrats are trying to get across goodies that they've wanted for years. But we're in a national crisis, and the closure of schools creates a huge opportunity for the educational technology industry, because they'll say, well, we'll put all kids online, and now we don't need schools. The problem is that we have a very large number of evaluations that say that virtual schools are a disaster. Kids they click on, they click off, they get distracted, they'd rather watch cartoons, and it's very hard to hold children's attention. And so we do have a significant ed tech industry of virtual charter schools, and they're all the worst almost every one of them is the worst performing school in its state. So we can't look to the future and say, well, now we'll just keep kids home and close the schools. Someday, hopefully, we will be back to something approximating normalcy, where we have a federal government that actually cares about children and cares about families. Instead, what we have now is a complete vacuum of leadership in which people are not being tested, in which our economic life, our social life, our communal life, everything is being closed down, and nothing is being done at the federal level other than to close our borders. It's like saying, calling 911 and saying there's a burglar in my house and then being told to lock your doors.
Right.
The burglar is in the house. The virus is loose, and it's in almost every state in the country. So I hope that the ed tech industry gets reined in and doesn't see this as a permanent opportunity for them to keep making profits, and that when we get beyond this horrible moment, or before we get beyond this horrible moment, we have to think about what's in the best interest of children. They have to eat. They have to have medical care. Their parents have to have enough money to pay their rent. People shouldn't be kicked out of their homes because they can't pay their mortgage. These are all the practical issues that have to be dealt with. And then at some point when we get back to real life, we have to think about strengthening our public institutions so that we're able to respond to crises and not have zillions of children in little public-private schools who, without any coordination of the response. The response has to be we're all in this together, and we have to have public institutions that function in a vigorous and dynamic way to solve problems, and a private sector that does what the private sector does best, which is to compete and to have winners and losers, and to have a reasonably sound economy.
Diane Ravitch, research professor of education at NYU, founder and president of the Network for Public Education, and author of Slaying Goliath, The Passionate Resistance to Privatization and the Fight to Save America's Public Schools. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. And really, honestly, thank you so much for all the work that you have done in pushing back on this corporate reform movement. It has been it's been gratifying to watch, where this has gone, at least. This is one of the few areas where I think like that kind of money has been able to be has been able. There's been a significant resistance to that type of overwhelming amount of money that has been poured into this, and I appreciate.
Well, I'm hoping and hopeful that if there is another president, that they will learn from the past. But who knows? We'll have to see, and keep pushing and keep resisting and keep fighting against bad ideas and protect public education, which is one of the great treasures of our society.
Diane Ravitch, thanks again.
Thank you.